And Rumaan, I'm going to turn it over to you to set up our first reading.
Great. Thank you so much, Melanie, and to the Center for Fiction. It's such a great pleasure to be here, and such a particular sadness that we can't be in the same space together. But let me tell you, I have been a very lucky person the entire run of this particular book, and my luck continues in having two performers of such incredible talent bring the work to life in a way that a reading from me never, ever could. Marin is going to read a section of the book that comes early in the novel. You don't really need to understand anything about what's happening except for that it's describing the protagonist of the novel grocery shopping on her way to a vacation home.
Amanda volunteered to go to the grocery. They'd passed a store and she retraced that path. She drove slowly, windows down. The store was frigid, brightly lit, wide-aisled. She bought yogurt and blueberries. She bought sliced turkey, whole grain bread, that pebbly, mud-colored mustard, and mayonnaise. She bought potato chips and tortilla chips and jarred salsa full of cilantro, even though Archie refused to eat cilantro. She bought organic hot dogs and inexpensive buns and the same ketchup everyone bought. She bought cold, hard lemons and seltzer and Tito's vodka and 2 bottles of $9 red wine. She bought dried spaghetti and salted butter and a head of garlic. She bought thick-cut bacon and a 2-pound bag of flour and $12 maple syrup in a faceted glass bottle like a tacky perfume. She bought a pound of ground coffee, so potent she could smell it through the vacuum seal, and size 4 coffee filters made of recycled paper. If you care, she cared. She bought a 3-pack of paper towels and a spray-on sunscreen and aloe because the children had inherited their father's pale skin. She bought those fancy crackers you put out when there were guests, and Ritz crackers, which everyone liked best, and crumbly white cheddar cheese, and extra garlicky hummus, and an unsliced hard salami, and those carrots that are tumbled around until they're the size of a child's fingers. She bought packages of cookies from Pepperidge Farm and 3 pints of Ben & Jerry's politically virtuous ice cream and a Duncan Hines boxed mix for a yellow cake and a Duncan Hines tub of chocolate frosting with a red plastic lid because parenthood had taught her that on a vacation's inevitable rainy day, you could while away an hour by baking a boxed cake. She bought 2 tumescent zucchini, a bag of snap peas, a bouquet of curling kale so green it was almost black. She bought a bottle of olive oil and a box of Entenmann's crumb-topped donuts, a bunch of bananas and a bag of white nectarines, and 2 plastic packages of strawberries, a dozen brown eggs, a plastic box of pre-washed spinach, a plastic container of olives, some heirloom tomatoes wrapped in crinkling cellophane, marbled green and shocking orange. She bought 3 pounds of ground beef and 2 packages of hamburger buns, their bottoms dusty with flour, and a jar of locally made pickles. She bought 4 avocados and 3 limes and a sandy bundle of cilantro, even though Archie refused to eat cilantro. It was more than $200, but never mind. I'm going to need some help. The man placing every item into brown paper bags was maybe in high school, but maybe not. He wore a yellow t-shirt and had brown hair and an overall square affect, like he'd been carved from a block of wood. There was some stirring watching his hands at work, but vacations did that, didn't they? Made you horny, made everything seem possible, a life completely different than the one you normally inhabited. She, Amanda, might be a mother temptress, sucking on a post-adolescent's hot tongue in the parking lot of the Stop and Shop. Or she might just be another woman from the city spending too much money on too much food. The boy, or maybe he was a man, put the bags into a cart and followed Amanda into the parking lot. He loaded them into the trunk and she gave him a $5 bill. She sat, the engine idling, to see if she had cell phone service, and the endorphin rush of the arriving emails, Jocelyn, their agency director, one of the clients, 2 missives sent to the entire office by the head project manager, was almost as sexual as that flutter over the bag boy. There was nothing important happening at work, but it was a relief to know that for certain, rather than worry that there was. Amanda turned on the radio. She half recognized the song that was playing. She stopped at the gas station and bought Clay a pack of Parliaments. They were on vacation. That night, after hamburgers and hot dogs and grilled zucchini, after bowls of ice cream with cookies crumbled on top of them, and maybe some sliced strawberries too, maybe they'd fuck, not make love. That was for home. Fucking was for vacation. Sweaty and humid and tantalizingly foreign in someone else's Pottery Barn sheets. Then go outside, slip into that heated pool, and let the water wash them clean. And smoke one cigarette each and talk about what you talked about after you'd been married for as long as they'd been. Finances, the children, fever dreams of real estate, how nice it would be to have a house like this all their own. Or they'd talk about nothing, the other pleasure of a long marriage. They'd watch television. She drove back to the painted brick house.
Wow. Thank you so much. That's extraordinary. That was extraordinary.
Thank you.
Tonya is going to read from a later section in the book. It's really kind of self-explanatory, but she is going to be principally focused on a character named Ruth, who is distinct from the character we just heard about in Marin's reading. Go ahead.
Years ago, GH took me to the ballet. It was the kind of thing we claimed was the reason to live in New York to begin with, but it was a logistical nightmare. Tickets for a mutually agreeable night, a place to have dinner at 6:30, $18 an hour for the sitter. We were too busy to be committed to the notion of our own overcommitment. Could we not spare a few hours for transcendence? Swan Lake. I remember thinking at first, oh, this is so odd. People in spangled costumes, they dance for a few minutes, then scurry off the stage, and then they do it again. I thought it was a story, but a ballet is just a bunch of short things loosely organized around a theme that doesn't make much sense to begin with. Birds in white and birds in black, and big sweeping music. I think it was the most beautiful music I've ever heard in my life. There was this one dance I'd never heard before, and I don't know why they don't use it in movies and commercials. It's so beautiful. I bought the CDs. Swan Lake, conducted by Andre Previn. I remember the name of the piece. Pas d'action, Odette and the Prince. You never heard anything more sweeping and romantic, and then so sweet and alive. Tchaikovsky was 35 when he composed Swan Lake. Did you know that? It was considered a failure. But you know, it's the very idea of ballet, a dancer dressed as a bird. I remember thinking, it's a maudlin thought, but I suppose we all have thoughts like that from time to time. If I had to die, and we all do, if I could hear music as I was dying, or have a piece of music that I knew would be the last thing I heard before I died, or that came to my mind as I was dying, even just the memory of it, I would want it to be that. Tchaikovsky, this dance from Swan Lake. That's what I'm sitting here thinking about. Though perhaps you won't like to hear it, but I was thinking, God damn, I have those CDs in my apartment. I may never hear Pas d'action, Odette and the Prince ever. I think I have it. I think I can hear it. The heart, the strings, but I might be wrong. But what I have in here is beautiful.
Amazing.
So amazing.
Really, yeah. Thank you both. So, I mean, it's really a gift for me to be able to hear this brought to life by a performer. Really, really beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you both. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jessica for the conversation.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Tonya and Marin, for those brilliant readings. I'm Jessica, and it's my great pleasure to be here tonight with the Center for Fiction and with Rumaan to talk about his extraordinary book. As mentioned before, we're going to chat for a little bit. But in the meantime, if you have questions, please do submit them, and we will get to them in a little bit. Hello, Rumaan.
Hi.
That was amazing.
I mean, I'm never going to be able to read those sections from the book to an audience when the bar has been set that high, you know? And it's just extraordinary to me. I mean, as you know, Jessica, it's almost a violation of like the Geneva Convention, how many times you have to read your own work as in the process of building the drafts into a finished novel. And then you think you kind of lock the page and then you have to read it and reread it and reread it. And the copy editor is asking you to reread it. And so after a while, it's sort of like with any word that you would repeat too much, it just feels like you can't even tell if it's not nonsense any longer. And to hear somebody hear a different reader bring it back to you, it's like, oh, I did write something that sort of makes sense. It's not just the nonsense of me staring at the same words on the page.
And hearing Tonya put space between the thoughts and like remembering your way into a piece of music, and you feel that when you're reading it, but it's just a completely different experience to hear it.
Totally.
And this is sort of the perfect place to start, because having just heard these brilliant interpretations of your work, I wanted to start by asking if you in particular tend to have a skeleton key into your characters, whether it tends to be the sound of their voice that you can hear in your head, or a certain gesture or quirk of communication where it's like, yes, that's who that person is. Like, what's your way in?
I really, I enjoy the strange breaks in human logic that we all have. And so I enjoy the moments when they start to feel like they have some volition and that they're doing things that I couldn't necessarily have predicted. The example I always cite in this context is a Woody Allen movie, Hannah and Her Sisters, when Barbara Hershey's character kisses Michael Caine's character, her sister's husband. And the first thing she says is, I have to get my teeth cleaned next week. And it just seems to me like exactly the kind of thing that you would actually say as a real human being in a moment of heightened tension. That, you know, the moment your kid falls and breaks their arm on the playground and you're rushing to pick them up and you think, oh my God, we're out of bananas. I have to remember to go get bananas. Then that seems to me like how people really think and how people really work. And so it's less about like, it's like the logic of their own illogic. And once I feel like I've cracked that Amanda, for example, in the section that Marin read, Amanda's husband, Clay, is a smoker, a secret smoker, and she decides on the way home to buy him a pack of cigarettes, which is this weird acknowledgement that she knows that he's smoking on their holiday. And it's like things like that that sort of break what I might have guessed to be the logic of the person.
Right. I have to say that Amanda's grocery store litany will haunt every trip to Seatown I ever take. I was in Seatown yesterday, and when I saw the cilantro, I thought, Archie doesn't like cilantro.
Thank you. I mean, that makes me very happy. I mean, I think that the things that we buy are the story of who we are. And the things that we buy to eat, especially to eat with our families, are a very private story, but it's still a story of we are the kind of family who eats organic meat. We're the kind of family who eats, but also we're the family who enjoys these box donuts. I love those donuts, to be clear. And it's just a way of saying this is who we are. This is how we've defined ourselves. And I hope that the experience for the reader in that moment is to read all these things that this person is buying, but to really feel like you understand a lot about her. And you understand a lot about the perspective of the book. Also, that the carrots are the size of a child's fingers feels like menacing and creepy, or that the zucchini is tumescent feels like animal and sexual, like that there's a lot revealed in that thing that is fundamentally just a list of things to buy.
Mm-hmm. But I think that one of the many strengths of your book is how rooted it is in these granular and maybe at first blush just sort of quotidian details. Like, these are all the things in my grocery cart. The book is always just very aware of having a body and serve. Yeah. And I can't go into it too much without spoilers, but just the experience of having a body is explored in so many different and rich ways in this book, in the service of something that could almost feel horrifyingly abstract, which is some kind of apocalyptic situation. And I wondered how important that was for you in sort of tracing a path through writing the book.
I mean, I think you have like an inside answer because you and I you looked at a book of this book. You looked at a draft of this book. So you understand that like that's part of the agenda of the book. Just as we are trapped on this planet, just as the people in this book are trapped in a house, we are all trapped in our bodies. And that is what makes us animals. And you know, when you hear in Tonya's reading, you heard Ruth talking about this, the exaltation of art and like the mind, and you know, the thing that makes us what we pretend is the higher animal. I don't really know if we are the higher animal or not, but we're also still hostage to the things that make us simply an animal. And the book is really interested in those things: smell, sex, and I think there's like it's of interest for a reason, I think. But yes, it is certainly part of what the book was trying to pursue. Right.
I think that the book is obviously in conversation with contemporary novels of apocalypse like Severance and Station 11 and others that we could name. And I wondered, in writing this book, what was your relationship with, I guess, what we could call apocalypse art? Like, were you a student of every apocalypse tinged book? Like, you wanted to know everything, or you know, were you avoiding it out of, you know, fear of undue anxiety of influence, or where were you on that spectrum?
Yeah, it's more the latter. So you and I are exactly the same age, so I know that we have a lot of the same pop cultural references, and I remember the way in which like sitcoms talked about nuclear war, right? So there was a sense that like Reagan was going to pick up the red telephone, and that like the bombs were going to fall, and that Russia was going to annihilate us, and that our entire way of life was going to collapse. So I think that we have had this particular line in the culture for a long time, maybe since the beginning of the atomic age, right? And it's become buried under layers of irony to the point that it's like a sitcom joke as opposed to like existential crisis. I'm not that interested in what you've called apocalypse art, although I have. So I avoided them. I avoided those works. I avoided Station 11 and I avoided Severance while I was writing this book, because I understood that there was a shared sensibility or shared interest thematically. And then I read both of those books in the years since, and I think they're both extraordinary. And I'm like delighted that anybody would put my book into that particular company. I think that's like a hugely flattering for me comparison. I don't know if Emily St. John Mandel or Ling Ma will feel the same way, but I do think that it's also one of those things that this is in the culture, and this is something that people are responding to, and that it's not necessarily fixed in 2020. I think Station 11 is from 2015, maybe. That there is a sense of being at the end of history that we've been holding on to for, indeed, if it is since the beginning of the atomic age, then that's half a century. So for half a century, we've been telling ourselves this is the end of history. So, you know, we're clearly wrong, but maybe we're being proven right. It's hard to say.
Should we? I realize that we haven't really synopsized the book for our audience. I mean,
this is such a hard one. Yeah, we have.
Do you want to give it a try?
I mean,
that's terrible oversight on my part, by the way.
No, it's fine. We just hit the ground running. What I tend to say is that I don't believe in spoilers, but I do think that there's a certain kind of experience I want you to have with this book. And so I don't want to like step on that experience for the reader. But so essentially this is a book about a white aspirational middle-class Brooklyn family of 4 going to Long Island on a summer holiday. And that holiday spins very far off the rails with the arrival of these strangers who say that they own the house. And then there are a couple of turns that shift the book from being a book about people on holiday to a book about the world in which we all live right now. So that's usually my like non-committal synopsis. I don't know if that suffices.
Yeah, and I think that by this extraordinary stroke of timing, that Leave the World Behind has become, the first quintessential pandemic novel. It's a novel about people in a house, really scared about what's happening outside and not really understanding what's going on outside. But when I first read a draft of it 2 years ago, it read very much as a climate catastrophe.
Yeah.
And it's obviously both. But I hope this isn't a spoiler, but what I will say is that despite various forms of impending doom in the book, the lights stay on for a really long time.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say how long.
Yeah.
And I thought that was such an amazing, lots of other things don't stay on, but the lights stay on.
Yeah.
And I thought that was an amazing device in terms of reading it as a climate catastrophe book, because I think there's a certain degree of delusion and deflection that we all require to just get through the day, knowing the climate catastrophe is coming.
Yeah.
And I think one way of doing that is like, well, the lights are still on. Do you know what I mean? And and that struck me really hard reading it a second time recently, because I picked it up and like, this is the 2020 pandemic book, but it's still so incredibly resonant as a climate book. In a completely different way from, say, Jenny Offel's book. And I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit, and about how maybe what you assumed what would be the perception of the book has changed.
I mean, I'm not sure that I'm not sure I had like a proper sense of what was going to happen to the book. I think maybe it's an act of delusion to think that anything but indifference will greet any book. So I probably just sort of assumed indifference. But I did think of it as being a book that was really interrogating climate, or metaphorizing what's happening to the climate, right? Because much as they can't leave the home in which these fake people find themselves, we real readers can't leave the planet on which we find ourselves. Like, we are trapped here. There is no leaving it behind. But it's kind of remarkable how quickly the real world context can shift right under your feet. And this happens to people all the time, that like a cultural product will seem like it is going to be one thing, and then something will happen in the culture and it will change. This happens when Hollywood has like shoot 'em up movies, and then there's like a big school shooting because there's one of those every week, and then this movie studio is like, oh, we shouldn't release this horrible movie about people being shot because somebody just got shot in reality. So you can't, like, artistically, you can't outrace the cultural cycle. And in this particular instance, I suppose, I think it's a lovely reading. And I think if the book feels more urgent to people right now because they are literally trapped at home in much the way the characters are, I welcome that. And I love that. And the book never really explains itself. There's a sense of emergency, but the book is very evasive about the nature of that emergency, which is a kind of a convenient choice on my part, because you fill in the blank with the thing you most fear. And, for you, that was an experience of thinking about the climate when you read this book a couple of years ago. But right now we're thinking about, everything else that's happening in the politics or in the culture. It's a sort of like a one size fits all, or like, whatever you need it to be, it will be that for you,
it's a living text. Yeah.
I was gonna say it's like a Thneed. Do you remember in the Lorax when in the Lorax, the Oncer makes these things out of the truffula trees, and it can be anything. It can be like literally anything you need, and that's what it's like. It's like, okay. I like your more highbrow reference stuff.
I mentioned previously that the lights stay on. Something that doesn't stay on in your book is the internet. And I feel like every contemporary novel, and especially any contemporary novel that deals with this kind of possibly apocalyptic scenario, has to figure out its own relationship to the internet. And I wondered if I wondered if it was freeing or prescriptive or challenging in any particular way that this was a contemporary novel with no internet and no television after a certain point either.
Yeah. It was so it's really, I think it's very difficult to reconcile the artistic impulse with like the brute, ugly language of technology, right? And so you can like write about the past, which helps you dodge the imperative to write about like the technology we use to conduct our lives. But it's very hard to fold into, at least it is for me, to fold into the narrative like, oh, this person is driving somewhere, therefore they need to be looking at the GPS, or like this person has a kid and therefore the kid must like shout something at Siri or Google or whatever kids do, you know, like that to establish the texture of reality, you have to like write about reality as it is. And so I have dodged writing about the internet in a lot of my work. It's sort of a similar thing about the pandemic, right? Like, well, the fiction that emerges from this that is not engaged with talking about illness or contamination, will it nevertheless have to talk about the act of putting on a mask to simply establish that you're fixed in a real universe? It's hard to know. And the language of the internet and all of that stuff it's ugly. It doesn't feel like novelistic to me. But what I get to have it both ways because the internet breaks. And so these people are obsessed with getting it back. They're obsessed with that lack of connection in exactly the same way that we all are when you're on the subway for that one stop between like Nevins and Hoyt where you lose your cell phone service and you're sitting there with your phone. You're like, geez, like, what if this is the moment that I'm getting the push alert that a war has broken out? What if this is the moment that the MacArthur Foundation is like, hey, you got to respond to this email in 4 minutes, otherwise we're not going to give you a Genius Grant. Like, we're so connected to our technology and we're connected to our notion of connection itself. Mm-hmm. And when you deprive people of that, I think you feel it. I think there's a sense of creeping tension in the book, but I think one of those tensions is simply the idea for the reader that it would be very uncomfortable for them to find themselves without internet service. Mm-hmm. You know,
and you do something very suggestive in the passage that Marin performed, which is you sort of yoke together the amorous and the technological. Amanda needs some kind of frisson.
Yes.
And she thinks it might be the grocery boy, but actually it's her phone. And that's very funny and very sad.
I mean, I'm glad you think it's funny. I think it's hilarious.
It's so funny.
There's another moment in the book where Amanda's husband is like sexually aroused by the expensive dishwasher. I think our relationship to technology as like a commodity, as luxury good in the case of this like German dishwasher, or just as like that portal into community that we think it is, it's very profound. It's rewiring how we think. Mm-hmm. And, you and I are young enough that we didn't grow up this way, right? Like, this is like new stuff. My older son keeps asking me if I had a cell phone when I was in 6th grade, because he is lobbying to have a cell phone now that he is in 6th grade. And I think he genuinely cannot conceive of a reality in which a cell phone does not exist. Mm-hmm. Which is fair, because that's his entire reality. This has been his entire life. And since he was a baby, he has seen his parents holding cell phones up to his face and taking his picture. Mm-hmm. It's doing something to us, but what it is doing to us, I think we don't know the answer yet. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think of you as someone who somehow manages to be immersed in fiction as a critic, as a writer, as a reader, and extremely online at the same time. And I know how not extremely online, moderately online. You're good at being online. Like, you're good at Twitter. And I wondered, like, what kind of cognitive seesaw is that for you? Because for me, it just feels very all or nothing. Like, I'm either between Hoyt and Nevins, like that, or I'm between Hoyt and Nevins, like, reading a book. And I've like for 5 minutes of my life forgotten that I have a phone. But I feel like you have struck a balance, and I wondered if you have any advice.
I mean, I think in some ways, again, this might have to do with how old we are. That we were already adults when this technology became the thing that it is. And so we have an ability to leave it, to say like I'm not interested in this moment. I can still lose myself in a book. I think a lot of it has to do with your own internal wiring, I think. But I do think that I'm not going to say I have a healthy relationship to my phone. I spend hours on my phone every day. That's not normal. If I spent as much time like fencing as I do looking at my phone, I'd be in the Olympics, so that's not normal. But I do think that I have tried to understand it as part of my work. It brings me a connection to the culture, to the world that we live in. It brings me news. It brings me like to writers and other ideas. But I still have the ability to put it down and read a really good book. And I still really need that experience. And that before I go to bed, like I have to read before I go to sleep. I have to read something. And I tend not to be able to read something on my phone. It tends to that I have to read a book, almost always a novel, not necessarily one I'm looking at for work because I'm falling asleep, but I have this like connection to like a primal connection to that experience that I think I'm glad I have it. I'm glad I have it. And I will tell you, and I don't know if you're having this experience with your own children, it is hard as hell to inculcate that in other people. At least it is for me. It is really hard to teach my children to love that experience of being inside of a book the way that I do and did as a child. But I'm glad I have it because otherwise I am so online. I mean, who knows what would happen to me? I would just like the YouTube algorithm would just take over and I'd be a men's rights activist or something. Like, I don't know.
My kids, as you know, are 5 and 3, and they haven't quite, they are still just reading their picture books and don't really know what evils await them on YouTube and elsewhere. So I'll come to you for counsel. I wanted to talk to you, particularly in the context of Leave the World Behind. I wanted to talk to you about how your work as a critic informs your work as a fiction writer and vice versa. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, I absolutely love the ability or the opportunity, I should say, to write critically about a book. And the simple truth is that if you are spending time in the company of, like at this point, especially, I get to review books by all the writers who are better than me, right? Like I get to really shoot up. So I'm reviewing Ben Lerner or Ali Smith or Zadie Smith or Hari Kunzru. And usually when I'm reviewing a book, I feel like a moral responsibility to read some of the larger body of work. So I'm reading the new novel, but I also look back at the rest of the work. And if it's a small enough body of work, I try and read it all. That immersion in a single sensibility, that immersion in an artist who is developing, the ability to look at leaving the Atocha station and then to look at the Topeka school and look at the development that took place over those years. It's educational, but it is hard to articulate for me what the education is. It's really, really hard to say, like, what am I getting out of this? And sometimes I think the simple immersion in that sensibility is useful. Earlier this year, I reviewed Lori Moore's Collected Stories, which is a great, dream assignment. So I got to read the entire body of work. It's not it's a pretty big body of work at this point. It's a lot of stories. I read all of the novels. I read everything. And if you can do that for your job, you're pulling one over on somebody, and even though I'm looking at it critically as a critic, like that's the role I'm discharging, I can't help but stop and marvel at it as a writer. So I have these sticky tabs that I tab the books up to remember what I want to cite in the review. And then I go back through the tabs as I'm writing the review. And half of those notations make a lot of sense to me because I'm talking about something thematic or something that has to do with the overall structure of the book. And then some percentage of them are just me marveling at the aesthetic choice, at the language, the turn of phrase, at an idea. So being steeped in that work, I love it. I think it's I'm sure it's really useful to my work, although I'm not the one to say how.
And, talking about the pleasures of watching an artistic sensibility develop through your 3 books, there are a lot of through lines. That Kind of Mother is a very different book from Leave the World Behind, but they are both about families. They are both quote unquote domestic. I don't know what your relationship to the word domestic is. That's probably a whole other webcast.
I love having that conversation. I love having that conversation.
And so, you've talked about Leave the World Behind as an opportunity to write a book that no one expected you to write. And yet it feels very much of a piece with your previous work. And that's a neat trick too. You sort of had it both ways. And I wondered how conscious that was, like you were setting a dare for yourself, and how much of it, I guess wasn't. It was just intuitive or something.
I mean, you're so hostage to sensibility. You just are. You're interested in the things you're interested in. You evolve over time. You grow over time. You become interested in new things, but you're still kind of fundamentally the same person, chasing the same totems, the same hobby horses. Like, you just do it without even realizing it. And so I think I probably thought this book was so distinct from my earlier work. And then have to look at it sometimes and think like, oh God, I'm such a one-trick pony. Like, I write about, I establish intimacy using food. I use the language of food to get at sensuality, or, I'm really interested in the intimacy between women, especially women who happen to be two different ages, especially women who are two different ages and two different classes. Mm-hmm. You are kind of the one-trick pony, because I think that's just what you are. And it's funny because I really love writers who are consistently inconsistent, like Willa Cather, who can write about the prairie, but then can write about the desert, or can write about Quebec, and shift through literal geography and sort of also psychic geography. But then I also really love writers who are incredibly consistent, like Anita Brookner, who wrote the same novel 23 times. I really marvel at that. So I'm not sure which one of those modes I aspire to more, but I do think you're always kind of stuck with your own, you're sort of stuck in your body, you're stuck being yourself.
The ultimate example of the latter kind of writer for me is Alice Monroe. Alice Monroe just writes the same story over and over and over again, but every single time she makes it new. It's the wildest thing.
Yeah. I mean, good enough for Alice Monroe, good enough for anybody,
it's
right?
Supernatural. It's just how is this the same story, but a completely different, And that's thrilling. That's as thrilling.
I think so too. I think you find a lot in there. You find a lot in there. And if you think about art, you think about Agnes Martin, or somebody who was really chasing a very specific idea, a very specific visual idea, and did it over the course of decades. And clearly that the artist found something there, that the pursuit, that relentless pursuit of this thing yielded something for her intellectually. And you feel it emotionally. And you're right, those Alice Monroe stories, they're kind of all the same. But I do think there's a difference between the ones that come in the very mature years, the ones from friendship, love,
no, you're right.
And then but they're the same strategy. Mm-hmm. It's the emotional intelligence deepens, but the stories have the same strategy. It's incredible.
Relentlessness in one vein.
I admire that kind of stubbornness.
I wanted to talk a little bit before we move to questions. And again, if people in the audience have questions, please do submit them, and we'll get to them in a moment. We'd love to hear from you. But before that, I've noticed that a big point of conversation around Leave the World Behind is the matter of how much it withholds or conceals from the reader, and when it reveals certain secrets, and if it reveals certain secrets. And you said earlier in the talk that that the book is evasive, and I read I read the book a second time recently, and I was actually surprised at how explicit it is about certain things.
Jessica, please go on Goodreads and weigh in, because I'm with you. I think the book is very clear about what's happening, but it also does not sit you down and say, okay, let me level with you about what's happening. It leaves you room to dream, as David Lynch would say.
And I wondered, But like I guess this is also a question of like, how much are you writing for yourself and how much are you writing for an audience and how much are you reading for a Goodreads audience? But I wondered, is that a tricky dance for you?
Oh yeah.
Figuring out what to reveal and when to reveal it and how.
I mean, I will point out like the imperative of working with an editor you really trust, because it was my editors who showed me that the reader is having the same experience as the characters are having. The characters don't know what is happening in the world outside of this house, and they are afraid. The reader is experiencing that very same thing and is also afraid, but more than afraid, the reader is annoyed, because the reader is like, okay, what is happening? I need to better understand this. I need to have the leg up on these characters. And so the book has to provide that at some point. And the book does begin, I think, like at the midpoint when the children go into the woods, I think is when the book starts doling out a little more information and telling you what's happening. Mm-hmm. But it is not scary if the book simply says, okay, aliens have landed in Times Square, or there has been a coup in Iran and they have launched a bomb that no one knew they had. Like, that's not scary. What's scarier, to me anyway, is to be told a couple of distinct facts and try and force them together and make sense of them. Mm-hmm. And that feels to me analogous to how we live in the world today. How many push alerts did we get on our phones today from the New York Times? I've lost count.
I turn them off.
You should. Well, you're a smarter woman than I am.
I only get push alerts from the New Yorker.
Well, you're much smarter than I am, because I get one constantly. Purdue Pharma did this. So-and-so did this. This person died, whatever. And you try to take these pieces and force them into a logical whole. Reality does not work that way. It doesn't work. It doesn't get you any information. Knowing the headlines from the New York Times does not get you any information. And so that, to me, is the design of the book, that you know all this different information, but you can't make it fit into a cohesive whole. And that, to me, is very, very, very scary. To me, that is actually much scarier than anything I could have devised. If I had created, oh, there are aliens, or there was a war, or whatever, that's scary, but you understand how to hold on to that. You understand how to file that away. When I'm just saying, we don't know. There's this, like, this is an algebra problem that is not solvable. That feels really frightening to me.
What was that documentary years ago about the murderer, and the New York Times sent a push alert that started killed them all? Do you remember this?
Yes, it was Robert Durst, right?
The Robert Durst documentary. They sent, when that aired, the New York Times sent a push alert that said killed them all. And I had not been watching this documentary. I was ambiently aware of it. And I remember getting that push alert on my phone at like 11:02 p.m. And I was scared in the way that your book is scary. Yeah. Because I had this one fragment of insane information and I had nothing to tether it to. Yeah.
Which is, that's exactly, and that's how we feel right now. I think that's how we feel. Do you remember when I'm going to forget his name, but when this very vocal Russian dissident was poisoned on the airplane? It just happened, at the end of last year. Mm-hmm. That is terrifying, truly terrifying.
Alexei Navalny.
Yes, Navalny. Thank you. Yeah. But we can't fit that piece into the larger puzzle. So it's like when you're literally doing a jigsaw puzzle, it's like that's that weird piece that is purple, and you're like, I don't see where the purple is, so I don't know what to do with this piece. And that is how I feel about so much of the news about Navalny, about climate change, about fires. So I just, there was a story, I think it was in the Times, about fires in some part of the world that I didn't even know existed. And it was oh, this part of the world can't burn down because then we'll all die, but it's on fire right now. So it's FYI, this part of the world exists and it's on fire, so it's not going to exist much longer. And it's how do you fit all this together?
Yeah. Navalny, incidentally, did an extraordinary interview with Masha Gessen recently, in which he explains, slowly figuring out, coming out of a coma and processing over weeks what had happened to him, you know, who his wife was, what had happened to his body, what is this place? It's a hospital. I'm in Berlin. And then emerging from that like total cognitive fog into an investigation of what had happened to him, lab results, all the evidence that he had to prove that he was poisoned. And I had not thought about your book in editing this interview, but now I'm thinking like, yeah, it's just taking these little pieces and trying so hard to piece them together, and it's terrifying. And your book really captures that.
And to acknowledge that, like, in some ways, you can't complete the puzzle. That's how novels work. Like, that's how Agatha Christie works, right? And there's a real pleasure in that. Like, I'm not trying to discount the particular pleasure of a novel that solves the problem it is presenting. I love that. But that's not the game of this book. It's not the strategy of this book. And to me, if this book is scary, to me, what is most frightening about it is the ways in which this very outlandish scenario captures the emotional reality that we actually live in. Like, it's all pretend. Everything that happens in this book is pretend, and it gets very high. The level of pretending gets quite big by the end of the book. Gross things happen. Bad things happen. But I hope the reader greets even those bad things with a feeling of recognition. Because that's kind of the world we live in right now.
Right. This might be a good moment to take a look and see if there are any questions for Rumaan. And I hope I'm looking in the right place for them. Let me see. It's mostly happy greetings from around the country. I don't think we have any questions yet.
Jessica, if you click where it says ask a question.
Oh gosh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. There's a whole bunch of questions here. I'm so sorry. Okay, here's one. Can you talk about the threads of race and class and how you decided how much each of these threads played into the plot of the book? Great question.
Yes, I can. I am having a lot of fun with certain narrative conventions. One of them being like the knock at the door by a person of a different race, right? Like, we just know that from our cinema. And that prepares us for a book that is going to be maybe a comedy of manners about race. Maybe even like a dark satire about race. But I think what it doesn't prepare you for is a book that's actually not, that is interested in race, but is interested in something else also, that is interested in pushing past that. So I think this book talks about race, but also looks past it. And I think this book talks about class, but also looks past it. And I think it suggests what I kind of believe, which is that the fallacy of believing that your class difference will save you is precisely that, the fallacy. And that the fallacy of getting too bogged down in a conversation that is only about race fails to account for like what's really happening culturally and politically. I'm not saying that race and class are not important. They are obviously very important, and they determine a lot about like how the world functions. But I do think that the book is pushing on them a little bit and suggesting that maybe there is this other thing looming, this other thing that is bigger than the politics of identity and the politics of this moment.
Let's see what else we've got. Will your son get his phone soon?
I don't know.
Ruth
I mean, I don't know. I worry about its effect on a developing psyche. I really do. And I know that seems like hopelessly like school marmish of me, but I just don't know what it will do to him. That particular like reward, that endorphin thing, it's just like, it's frightening. And you know, as N+1 sort of famously told us, like the the internet is just like a sex device. And, you know, and I want to protect his childhood. I want to protect his childhood. That's a fleeting thing. You never get it back. Once it's over, it's over. The door closes. Yeah. And I want to keep him there for as long as he's allowed to be there.
Right.
But all he wants is a phone. So I'm torn between satisfying. Like I could be dad of the year if I bought a phone tomorrow, you know.
Well, also it turns us into such hypocrites because we need our phones to work. I'm constantly looking at my phone. I need my phone. You know, I need my phone for my daughter to do her homework. I need my phone to like communicate with my babysitter. You know, like I'm staring at my phone all the time. Like, why wouldn't my kids want a phone?
Absolutely. And they call you on that hypocrisy all the time. And it's a difficult place to sit, you know? Yeah.
Rob wants to know, he's saying that he understands why you left the chaos producing event and Leave the World Behind ambiguous, but do you know privately, secretly in your own head what the event was?
Oh, no.
You don't know what it is. Okay.
I have no idea. I have no idea.
You're there with Amanda and Clay.
I am.
And GH and Ruth, and you don't know. That's amazing.
I had somebody say to me that they felt that perhaps nothing had happened.
Mm-hmm.
That it was all a fever dream. And I actually love that reading because who's to say? Who's to say? Like the book has no particular suggestion. I mean, I think the book definitely suggests that something is happening, but there's no way. The book doesn't ever say like, "Oh, this is real and not a dream."
Right.
So maybe it is a dream. Like it's. I love that feeling of like it's really in the hands of the reader to decide, and I include myself in that. I think if I knew and didn't tell you, then that makes it kind of a bad faith exercise.
Mm-hmm.
It makes it a trick.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think of it as a trick. I think of it as something that like those are the conditions of the story, and I am hostage to them just as the reader is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah, you know, we were emailing briefly a day or two ago, and Never Let Me Go came up as an example of you know, like an ultimate achievement in just meting out, you know, accreting detail. So that like this dreadful realization comes upon the reader almost in tandem with how the realization comes upon the characters, who they are, why they are, what is going to happen. It's extraordinary and it's excruciating. It's just perfect and
masterpiece. That is a masterpiece. That book. I mean, Jessica, you just read it. I know.
I just read it.
I love that book so much that I have not reread it. I am scared to reread it because I'm so in love with my particular experience of having read that book for the first time. But it's precisely as you say. It's a pure act of authorial control, but not in the way that like Lars von Trier controls his audience. It's not it's not a mean-spirited control. Ishiguro, I think, wants you to have this feeling of discovery that is parallel to the people he's writing about.
Right.
And so, as you're saying, like, you think this is a book about boarding school. You think it is a genteel boarding school book where there's a sense that something is off kilter, but it's very hard to put your finger on. And the book unfolds and unfolds, and it asks you these questions, but it answers one or two. It'll ask several, but it'll answer one or two. So there's enough to keep you invested in the reading beyond the obviously like sterling quality of the language. And then it just all like there's a point at which you, as the reader, you suddenly see the whole and you think, oh my God, this is what's happening in this book. I can't believe it. And I don't even want to say it right now because I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't read this book.
We don't want to spoil it.
It's truly an extraordinary experience to feel that in a book.
Yeah. But that withholding, as you say, it's not a gimmick. He's not toying with the reader.
No.
He is producing for the reader the feeling of what it's like to be these kids as they unravel the mystery of
who they are. I mean, it's truly it's so heartbreaking. Like even thinking about it, I feel like so like overcome. Like it's such an extraordinary book. And I thought a lot about that level of control. I mean, this is like saying I thought a lot about Picasso when I was painting, or like I thought a lot about Serena Williams when I was hitting the tennis ball. So I realize how ridiculous it is to say that, but like as an act of using the book to bring the reader in, to really seduce you, I wanted to have this feeling that I had in that book and I've had in other books, where it's not just that I'm reading a book, it's that I'm sitting on the lap of the writer and they're holding me really close and they're almost whispering it into my ear. It's this very private, almost like parental act. It feels so intimate and so profound. And there are certain books that provide that experience where you just cede control to the author. And I love that. And that was the aspiration for this book.
I was almost going to ask you a question about parenting and how it relates to Leave the World, but I think both of us would like start crying or something. I think we have time for one last question, and it's a very sweet question from BGC. I'll just read it. This story made me feel less silly about buying a puppy for a loved one who is terminally ill and will likely not see the puppy grow. Did grief or loss come to mind while writing Leave the World Behind? First of all, BGC, I'm so sorry to hear of this, and what an amazing tribute to Rumaan's book that you made this generous and really wonderful decision, and maybe this book helped you get there. That's really great. Thank you for telling us that.
I know, that's really lovely. I really love thinking about that. Yeah. Did grief help me? Anticipatory grief help me? Was that on my mind? Yes, I think it was. I think we look away a lot because we don't want to feel that discomfort of grief. We don't want to acknowledge like our elderly loved one is going to die, or our ill loved one is going to die, or our 11-year-old is going to cross that particular Rubicon into adolescence, which is effectively the same as adulthood, right? Like, we don't want to acknowledge those things. This part of the world that I can't even remember what country it's in is on fire. Like, we look away, we cast our attention to the side because that particular grief is very difficult to deal with. So yeah, I think it's a survival strategy, and I think it's a very human one. But I think the book has a sense of optimism in it for all of the ways in which we've talked about its particular reckoning with darkness. And I also think that I don't want to spoil the last lines of the book, but like, in a sense, the last lines of the book are sort of saying something along the lines of, why not have a puppy? Why not bake a cake? Why not have sex or go swimming or enjoy the cheese that you spent too much money on? Because in some ways, that's all we have. What we have is what we have. We have the world that we've made, and we kind of have to eke out some particular pleasure while we can. So yeah, I wish I had something better to offer us than that, but that's what I have.
I think that's a good place to wrap up. Melanie, did you have any last words for the audience?
Well, first of all, thank you to both of you. Rumaan, congratulations.
Thank you.
Beautiful book.
Congratulations, Rumaan.
Thanks again to Tonya and Marin, who are still in the audience. And thanks everybody for joining us tonight. And I hope you all just love reading this novel. And we'll see you again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.